recording so I don't
Mhm.
forget. Okay, we are officially recording.
Okay.
So everybody get nervous. No, we're officially recording. So this is going to be an awesome webinar about writing your passion project. And Steve Bagatourian, did I say it right?
Yeah, that was perfect.
Stephen Bagatourian's here. He is familiar now with Zoom. We did a little run through. So just a reminder to all the attendees, people may come and go, and that's fine. You're going to get a link of this recording later. But if you have a question for Stephen, use the Q&A box, which is down at the bottom next to, you'll see the mute, stop video, participants. Click the Q&A box, put it in there. And then if you want to chat amongst yourselves for reminders or whatever, use the chat box. But if you specifically have a question for Stephen, Q&A box. He may pause at points to check that out, or he may just do it at the end. However you feel, it's up to you. Totally up to you. Yeah, so, and I'll be here. Until then, it's all on you. Tell us about writing your passion project.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Brianna, for that lovely introduction. Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for attending. This is my first ever webinar, and hopefully it'll go really smoothly. So I chose to talk about the idea of writing your passion project today because I think that's something that's frequently sort of misunderstood with screenwriting, and something that people often get pressured away from doing is actually writing stories that you are passionate about and stories that you care about. And my career has been unique, and what I've discovered is that the greatest success that I've achieved in my career has always been when I have actually thrown commercial thoughts to the wind and just gone ahead and wrote stories that I really cared about. So I'm going to start off by just telling a series of anecdotes just about my own kind of career trajectory. And I've been a professional screenwriter now for a really long time, like 19 years, almost 20 years since I sold my first script, which I did when I was 21. So during that period, there's been a series of inflection points, I would say, where the fact that I wrote a script I really cared about, which people may have discouraged me from writing, ultimately yielded incredible results for me. So I'm going to go through these anecdotes kind of chronologically and take you guys through these experiences I've had. And then all of that is going to trigger some more thoughts and specifics on, just finding your voice as a storyteller and how to, really present your material that you're passionate about in a way that is most engaging to other people. So just a little backstory on me. I got into writing screenplays because I grew up just absolutely loving comic books. And I was a massive comic book geek as a kid. And as I got older in high school and stuff, I would say comic books continue to be a huge passion of mine, and so did music. And so probably comics and music were my two greatest influences. And when it came to movies, the sort of movies I really loved the most were films that were really imaginative and wacky and just outside of like the normal sort of assembly line product that most Hollywood studios make. My favorite filmmaker as a kid growing up was Terry Gilliam. And, he made such films as Brazil and Time Bandits and 12 Monkeys, and just incredible, unbelievable explosions of imaginative, idiosyncratic, beautiful filmmaking. And so he was a huge influence on me. So when I was about 19 years old, I took my first screenwriting class, and it wasn't like a formal film school kind of a class. I actually took an extension class in screenwriting, and I never went to a proper film school. I actually dropped out of high school when I was 16. And so that's why I'm very enthusiastic about non-traditional screenwriting and filmmaking sort of courses like they're doing here at Roadmap, because I know personally film school wasn't the path for me, but I found a mentor in an extension writing class, which, like I said, was just a night class and it only cost a few $100. And through that class, I started to learn the craft of screenwriting. And one thing I was really lucky with that I didn't realize how lucky I was at the beginning, was the fact that the teacher who I signed up for a class with just encouraged me to write whatever the hell I wanted to write. And he was like that with all the students. He was very non-directive, and he would basically just encourage you to reach inside yourself and find something that you really cared about, that you wanted to write. And so I wrote quite a few scripts in his class. And one of the first scripts I wrote was a script called Weasel. And Weasel was the story of a 12-year-old killer. And kind of a funny thing, the way that the idea for Weasel came to me was I was an obsessive Tupac fan at the time. I was, I still am a huge Tupac fan, but at the time I was completely consumed with Tupac, and there was a particular song, a Tupac song that I really adored. And every time I would hear this one song, during the opening of the song, I just had this odd visual that popped into my head. And the visual that would constantly pop into my head was just of a kid, a young kid, like, 11, 12-year-old kid wearing baggy clothes, face down, dead in the snow. And I couldn't shake that image every time I heard the song. And so that ended up sort of inspiring the opening sequence for the script Weasel that I started writing in my first screenwriting teacher's class. And when I initially pitched the idea, or even mentioned it casually in this class, my teacher loved it. He thought that, okay, wow, this sounds, edgy and weird, and a story of a 12-year-old killer, and, what led this kid to this point in his life. And the whole thing was told through flashbacks, and it was kind of all over the place. But my teacher loved the idea, and he was really enthusiastic and encouraged me to go ahead and, find the story in this idea. So when it came time to pitch the movie, it was like week 2 or week 3 of the screenwriting class. And like part of the process in this class was you'd come up with the idea, and then like within a week or 2, you'd pitch it to the class, and then you'd start writing pages. So when it came time to pitch Weasel, the teacher who, was the main teacher for the class, he was sick that week. And so he had a substitute covering for him. And when I pitched Weasel in the class with the substitute, she was horrified. And I still remember the look on her face as I finished my pitch of my very violent, dark, sort of twisty story of this 12-year-old killer. And at the end of it, she just looked, horrified and bemused. And she just looked at me and she said, "What on earth makes you think that anybody would want to watch that movie?" And I'd never gotten such a negative response to anything, in terms of a story idea. And so I was a little taken aback, but she was very critical, and she went on, at some length, talking to the rest of the class about how this was an example of, a waste of time, and how writers get caught up with these self-indulgent, terrible ideas that, are not going to appeal to anyone but themselves, and how she, with all of her wisdom and experience, strongly advised me to abandon this idea and come up with something that was going to be a lot more commercial, saleable, etc. So I was a little distressed by that, because at this point I was like 20 years old and I wasn't sure what to make of this reaction. I still wanted to write the script, but I was a little rattled. So the next week when I talked to my main teacher, he just said, "Oh no, that's ridiculous. Don't worry about that. Don't listen to her. She doesn't know you. She doesn't know your writing. It's a great idea. Just go for it." So with my main teacher's support and encouragement, I went ahead and I wrote Weasel. Now, this ends up being what I would call the first really big inflection point in my career. And Weasel, I think at this point, was the second screenplay I had finished. And I was 20 years old when I wrote the first draft. At that class, I had a friend in the class who was always entering screenwriting contests. And he pointed out to me that there was one particular contest that was out of Chicago, a screenwriting contest from an organization called Cinestory. And their whole sort of mission statement was that they wanted screenplays that were non-traditional, non-Hollywood, outside the box, etc. And so my friend said to me, like, "Hey, you might want to enter Weasel in this competition because it seems appropriate." So I did. I entered Weasel in the Cinestory screenwriting competition. And what ended up happening, to my great delight and to my parents' great happiness, I was one of the grand prize winners in the Cinestory contest that year. And so they flew me out to Chicago. It was the weekend I turned 21. I got a cash prize, which was a lot of money for me at that age. And it was just a wonderful thing. And I got to meet some famous writers out there. It was like an amazing whirlwind kind of a weekend. And when I came back from the Cinestory competition, now as an award-winning screenwriter for this script that I'd been told was a horrible waste of time, a week after I got back, John Cusack, the actor, his company called me up and contacted me and said they wanted to option Weasel, which was shocking to me. And I didn't even really know what an option was at that time. But I ended up optioning the script, which basically means that Cusack's company purchased the rights to the material for a set amount of time. I think it was a year. And then they ultimately renewed the option for a second year. And I suddenly was working with John Cusack and his company developing a feature film. And it was kind of mind-blowing. And shortly after Cusack optioned the script, I was contacted by an agent at the William Morris Agency. And this particular agent was a rather powerful agent at the time. He was actually the head of the lit department at the William Morris Agency. This is before they merged with Endeavor, so they were just William Morris at the time. But this agent called me in for a meeting, and he said to me, look, and he was kind of an old school, older sort of a fellow, but he said, look, kid, I don't really understand this script. I'm not quite sure what it's all about. It's really violent, it's really dark, but everybody in my office thinks it's amazing, and they all keep telling me how great it is. So I'm not sure exactly what you do, but I feel like I should be representing you. So I signed with the William Morris Agency. And so now, within quick succession, this script, which was supposedly so non-commercial and, such a ridiculous thing to spend my time writing, the script had now won the grand prize in a contest. It had been optioned by a major actor, and now I was being represented by one of the biggest lit agents in Hollywood. So at this time, I was 21, and I didn't really know at all how the business worked. And so I was kind of just flying blind, making it up as I went along. And one of the things you'll find in Hollywood is that very few people will give you the exact same advice. And a lot of times, that can be really upsetting or confusing when you really don't know what you should be doing. So, meaning I didn't know what my follow-up script should be. But my agent kept encouraging me that I needed to write something more commercial. Even though he had signed me based on a script that was not commercial and John Cusack had optioned the script, et cetera, my agent really felt strongly that I needed to be more of a commercial writer. So I went ahead and I took a shot at writing a very conventional sort of a Hollywood thriller. I wrote a kids movie. I wrote a big epic sort of Wizard of Oz fantasy sort of a piece. And these scripts were not even all entirely commercial, but they were like my version of what I thought I was supposed to be writing, a commercial story. In all of those cases, although the scripts had various, good qualities or whatever here and there, none of those scripts got me the kind of attention that Weasel had gotten me. And nobody optioned the scripts, nobody bought the scripts. And ultimately my agent was frustrated and I was frustrated because now I wasn't selling these scripts, nor did I feel like they were exactly what I wanted to write. So frustration started to set in a little bit there. And the next sort of inflection point, I would say, in my career was a couple years later, where one of my closest friends from childhood had just graduated film school. And he kind of had been witnessing my experience in Hollywood, what I was dealing with. And he said to me, look, man, this is ridiculous. Like, you're a good writer, but you're trying to write these things that, people think you should write or whatever. So let's write something we actually care about. Let's tell a story about something that we think is important. And that seemed like a good idea. So we sort of went back and forth for a while on topics. And ultimately we arrived at the topic of guns in America, which is obviously a very controversial topic, probably even now more so than ever. But at the time, we both felt like, all right, that's something we feel passionate about, and we have thoughts and ideas, and it's a very emotional sort of a topic. And we thought, let's write a really serious look at not necessarily the gun issue per se, but let's write something that talks about the people who are affected by guns in our country, whether it's good, bad, or in between. We were trying actually to write a film that was not going to be considered a big partisan sort of polemic. But in writing it, we were discouraged by every single person we knew, especially as we got into the story and we sort of broke down the various storylines we wanted to tell. It was an ensemble film, and American Gun was very much in the vein of something like Traffic and the way that Traffic looked at the issue of drugs in America. American Gun was sort of in that vein, but it was a very dark, sad story. And so everyone who read it, including agents, managers, various people around us, all sort of had the same reaction. They all just said, look, guys, what are you doing? Like, no one's going to want to make this movie. It's way too sad. It's about a topic that people don't really want to touch. This is just, again, a huge waste of time. So we finished the script. Myself and my co-writer, my friend Eric, who was also going to be directing the film. That was the plan from the beginning. And so ultimately, we start sending the script out to various agents. And like I said, most of them are very discouraging. But there is one particular agent who essentially says, look, I'm going to do you guys a favor because Eric happened to have graduated from Loyola Marymount Film School. This particular agent was an alumni of that film school. And he said, look, I'm way too busy to do anything with this, but you're an alumni. I want to help you out. I've got two little assistants in my office, junior agents who, they've got a lot of time on their hands. So why don't I let them help you out? And, they can send the script out to some actors and, see if anybody likes it. So that happened. And so this very dark, sad, heavy story about guns in America ends up getting sent out to some pretty big actors. And our first choice for the female lead in the story was Marcia Gay Harden. And Marcia Gay Harden had just won the Oscar for Best Actress for Pollock, the film about the painter Jackson Pollock. And so we didn't really think we had a great shot with Marcia, but she was our first choice. And I think she happened to be represented at the same agency that was now helping us. So we just thought, hey, what the hell, let's take a shot. So we took a shot with Marcia Gay Harden. And then I was not the one who received the phone call from Marcia, but I believe Eric, my co-writer, was the one who got the phone call from her. And I can remember just because he called me up the second after he got off the phone with her and recited it all to me verbatim. But he just said, Marcia Gay Harden just called me, and here's what she said. She said she literally had just finished reading the script, and she had a lump in her throat. And she said, oh my God, this story is just so sad. It's just devastating. It's the most sad, awful, horrible, sad story. And then there was a long pause after that. And then she continued and said, I love it. I have to do this. And please use my name if it helps you to get other actors on board, to get financing, whatever you got to do, use my name. If you need me to be at a meeting or anything, I'll be there. Just, I love the story. I had a strong emotional reaction to it. And that was it. She was in. So suddenly we had this really dark, sad story about guns in America, but we had an Academy Award-winning actress attached to star in it. And that changed everything. And in short order after that, we got the script out to Forrest Whitaker and to Donald Sutherland and to a young Amanda Seyfried before she became a big star. But all of those people responded positively to the script. So suddenly we had Forrest Whitaker, and we had Donald Sutherland, Amanda Seyfried, and then a bunch of other great actors, Tony Goldwyn, Nikki Reed. We just got an incredible cast, especially for young first-time filmmakers. And once we had those actors on board, we took the project out for financing. And suddenly companies who were sort of non-committal or on the fence before were happy to write us a check for a couple $1 million. So suddenly we had IFC Films and Participant Films behind our film. We had a couple $1 million. We had a cast with Oscar winners and Emmy winners in it. And we went off and we made our movie. And that was an incredible experience because it was the first time I'd written something where the actual words that I'd written were finding themselves being filmed and on screen. And it was an amazing experience, especially with that caliber of actors. And it represented another huge inflection point where I realized for all of my plotting and scheming to write something quote unquote commercial in the years before that, it was again this really dark, weird, sad story that had connected with people. And I think, I can just pause for a moment here to say that I don't believe that people are reacting to stories just because they're dark or sad or anything like that. That's silly. I think what people respond to in stories, period, is just passion. They respond to passion. They respond to genuine, authentic emotion. And if you can have that on the page, then that's just priceless, because most of the scripts that people read in Hollywood do read very much like things that are kind of engineered with sort of an end goal in mind. And that's just not the best way to write, an emotionally engaging, moving story. So American Gun ends up getting released in theaters, and it did not do well in theaters because apparently audiences did not agree with Marcia Gay Harden that they wanted to be part of a very sad story about guns. However, we did get some very nice reviews. We got 2 thumbs up from Ebert and Roper, which was a thrill for me. And then after a few months, to all of our surprise, the film got nominated for 3 Independent Spirit Awards, which is kind of like the Oscars for indie films. And we got nominated for major awards, which just really, literally stunned us. Nobody on our team was expecting it. We hadn't mounted any kind of campaign for it. So we got nominated for Best Actor for Forest Whitaker, Best Supporting Actress for Marcia Gay Harden, and Best Picture for the actual film itself, which just blew our minds because we were nominated against Pan's Labyrinth and Little Miss Sunshine and a couple of other films for Best Picture that year. And the other films we were nominated against were cultural phenomenons, and they had much bigger budgets than ours. So we ultimately did not win any of those Spirit Awards, but just the nominations were huge, and they definitely legitimized the film and added a certain level of buzz or class to the whole thing, and that made people want to meet with me and talk to me about writing other things. So right around that time, I was going on lots of meetings, and it was kind of cool that people were excited about American Gun, and so I was getting lots of opportunities. And I sold a TV show. It was a 1-hour TV drama that was honestly not something I was super passionate about, but it was a situation where a friend of mine had an opportunity to get me in to pitch some TV show ideas to the heads of some networks, and we kind of sold something that was sort of a twist on a cop show, nothing I was super passionate about. And so we sold it, and that was nice, and it was exciting. But ultimately, when it came time to write it, I found it very difficult to write something that was not, it was not coming from a real place for me. So the network that bought it was Fox, and although they paid me for the pilot script, once they read it, they were like, yeah, thanks, but no thanks. And so, that was frustrating. But again, I was trying to figure out, what is my voice? What do I want to write as a writer? Because at this point, I've got 1 produced credit. I've still got a big agent, and I've got opportunities and meetings I can go on. But really, the one way that you can direct your career and reinvent your career constantly is by the original material that you write yourself, that you're, initiating on your own. And that's the one huge advantage that you have as a screenwriter. So at that moment, I just decided, all right, well, I've got this, this place where I'm at the table now in Hollywood. People will talk to me, people will read my stuff, but, I'm just kind of feeling bored with so much of, what Hollywood wants me to write. And so at that time, I was still a huge Tupac fan, and I was a big, massive hip hop fan. And so I decided I'm just going to write a story that has to do with, in a weird way, with like my love of hip hop and how much music can affect people and change people's lives and change the way they look at the world. And so again, it was like in a very strategic sort of a way. I just started writing dialogue one day. I was at a coffee shop, and I just started writing dialogue, and it was just 5 pages of dialogue between these 2 kids in Los Angeles who, as I kind of pictured it in my mind, were 2 young Latino kids who loved Tupac. And I wrote 5 pages of dialogue that really was just amusing to me. And then I kind of started to think about where the story was going to go, what it could be. The script that I ended up writing was called Hearts of Men, or The Hearts of Men, which was named after a Tupac song. And the script was about a bunch of young men growing up in Los Angeles from different worlds, different backgrounds, a Latino kid, a Black kid, and a white kid who came from wildly different worlds. But the one thing that these three very disparate young people had in common is they were all obsessive fans of Tupac Shakur. And so I wrote Hearts of Men, and once again, I had my manager at the time, my agent at the time, just kind of looking at me a little funny. I think my manager was a little more supportive than my agent, but my agent was just like, well, what the fuck do you want me to do with this? Like, it's a story about three young kids who like Tupac, who gives a shit? And it's really violent and depressing. So really, who gives a shit? No one's going to make this. So it's a uniquely frustrating feeling that you'll have often in Hollywood, at least I have, where you feel like you've written something that's really good, something that maybe is the best thing you've ever written, and then it'll be greeted by a collective shoulder shrug, or worse yet, it's greeted by just outright scorn, which definitely happens. And so at that point, it's nice to at least feel like you're happy with what you wrote. And so if nothing else, I felt like, okay, I've got the script that I'm really happy with. So fair enough. Let me just put this on the shelf for the moment and let me see, maybe my manager's got a good idea. Maybe I should write something else. So once again, I put aside my passion project and I decided to write a more commercial script. And I pitched an idea for a comedy to my manager. A friend of mine and I, we decided to co-write it. My manager thought it was an incredible idea, so commercial, so saleable, blah, blah, blah. So we ended up going round and round in circles for about a year, writing maybe 3 or 4 iterations of this big comedy, and it was something they wanted to send to, who knows, just whoever the big comedic actors were of the day. There was a lot of enthusiasm at my management company over this idea, but the more that me and my friend worked on it and the more that we got these ridiculous notes over and over, we just kind of lost our enthusiasm for it. And by the end of it, we were left with a script that felt really sort of middle of the road, mediocre, and wasn't what we wanted at all. So that script gets sent out, and the script, which my manager thought was so commercial and can't miss, it ended up not selling. And there are a few feelings more devastating for me as a writer than feeling like you've just spent a whole fuckload of time working on something that you weren't even really that passionate about in the first place, and then no one likes it and it doesn't sell. So out of that frustration, again, I just start kind of like reevaluating my life and my career at that moment, like really like, what am I doing? The scripts that I like, they're not what Hollywood likes. What the hell am I doing here? And suddenly, as I'm sort of at a low moment, I get a call from my agent out of nowhere. And this is now maybe 7, 8 years ago. And my agent says to me, hey, Morgan Creek just called me and they're very interested in you writing the Tupac Shakur biopic for them. And I was like, what? Like, what Tupac Shakur biopic? And like, how did this happen? Like, how is Morgan Creek interested in me, of all people, to write this for them? My agent, to his credit, was honest. And he said, really, I have no idea. Like, I have no clue why they're calling for you, but they seem genuinely interested. They want you to come in tomorrow to pitch what you would do to tell Tupac's life story. And my agent said, are you able to be prepared tomorrow to go in there? And I said, yeah, I'm fine with that, because in the back of my head, personally, I'd been writing the Tupac movie for 15 years at that point, because I had a lot of thoughts on how Tupac's movie should be and how his story should be told. So I went in there for the meeting the next day, and it went really well. And I was really knowledgeable and passionate, and surprised all the executives with how much I knew about Tupac, and I had a take on it, and they responded to it, and it was like a really positive meeting. So I was assuming the whole time in my head, I'd just kind of come to the natural conclusion that the reason I was there at this meeting was because the executives must have read The Hearts of Men, which was, my script about the 3 kids who were obsessed with Tupac, because, why else would I be there? And so at the end of the meeting, I just made an offhand comment to the executives, and I said, wow, I'm sure glad I didn't listen to all the people who told me that, writing Hearts of Men was just a waste of time. And the executives looked at me with blank faces, and they were like, what's Hearts of Men? And I was like, well, it's my script that I wrote that deals with Tupac is like the central metaphor for the whole story. And it's got the kids all talking about Tupac and blah, blah, blah. I'm assuming, I thought that's why you guys had called me in. And they were like, no, we haven't even seen that script. We don't know anything about that. We actually had read a script of yours called Weasel, which a friend of ours had sent us. And I was like, oh, well, that's weird. Yeah, that's like my older script from a few years ago. And they were like, yeah, we just happened to be having lunch with an agent, and this agent heard we were doing the Tupac movie, and he was like, hey, have you read this guy who wrote the script Weasel? It seems like it's the right kind of tone, and seems like this guy could be perfect to write the Tupac movie. And I was kind of stunned, and I said, oh, like you had lunch with an agent? Was it my agent? And they were like, no, it was just some random agent who, an agent who represented other people, but he said to them over lunch that he didn't have any clients who he thought would work for the Tupac film, but he just happened to have read my script Weasel because someone happened to have given it to him earlier that week, and he loved it. And so he just happened to pass it along. And so then at that point, I was just kind of blown away by just the odds of that even happening. And then immediately we sent the company the Hearts of Men after my meeting with them, and then that, along with Weasel and along with my meeting, that closed the deal, and that got me hired on my first major studio assignment. So just to recap, I got hired on this huge studio assignment thanks to a 1-2 punch of 2 thoroughly non-commercial scripts that many, many people had discouraged me from writing, and that got me into the business of writing big Hollywood movies. So ended up working on the Tupac film for a while. I wrote the first 6 drafts on it, and it was a very different movie when I was writing it at the beginning, and I was writing it for a director, Antoine Fuqua, who had directed Training Day, and he was on board the Tupac film at the time. And so I was working on drafts, with an eye toward him directing, and, that was quite a fascinating experience, but that's a story for another day. While I was working on the Tupac film, a producer named Bill Strauss happened to read Hearts of Men, and he fell in love with it. Bill would later go on to produce Straight Outta Compton, but at this time he just produced a few indie films that had been at Sundance. Bill was a really big old school hip hop head from New York. He really responded to all the genuine passion and the emotion and all the hip hop trivia contained in Hearts of Men. He could tell it was really authentically coming from a real place. And so Bill was like, hey, I love this. I want to produce this. And I was totally cool with that. So Bill ends up getting Hearts of Men to a producer named Kathy Schulman. And Kathy Schulman, at the time, had recently won an Oscar for producing the film Crash. Kathy had won the Oscar for Best Picture. So she was a very big deal producer, and she was now running a company called Mandalay. She was the president of Mandalay. She read Hearts of Men. She loved it, and she optioned the script from me. So similar to how Weasel had been optioned in the past, she optioned Hearts, and now I was working for a couple of years developing Hearts of Men with Kathy and with Mandalay. During that time, I was developing the script with them. They had really good notes. The script got better and better. A lot of really smart people involved. And we were talking to directors to see who was going to direct it. And there were 2 directors that Mandalay and some of the other producers were really high on, and they wanted me to go meet with these directors and see if I liked them to direct the film. In both cases, I did not like these directors to direct the film. At my meeting with one guy, I got the distinct impression that he had not read the script that closely, and I just didn't like his vibe, and I didn't want to work with him. So I passed on the first guy, and I was told that I was being kind of a prima donna, and I needed to just be more grateful if a director was interested, blah, blah, blah. But at this point, although they had optioned the script from me, they knew that, I would be getting the rights back relatively soon, and they needed me to sign off on the director. So the second director they sent to me, also, nice guy, but I didn't really click with him, didn't feel like he had the right vision for the film. So I passed on him also. So the producers were getting a little annoyed with me at this moment, but I knew there was a better director out there for the script. So finally, a guy named Charles Stone III came in for a meeting, and he was best known for having directed Drumline and Paid in Full at that time. And Charles was just a phenomenal presence immediately from the moment I met him. He was such positive energy, and he loved the script and was so respectful and passionate. And I knew immediately, okay, this is the guy who should be directing Hearts. And so this is all concurrent with me writing the Tupac film. And after developing Hearts with Charles and with Bill and with Kathy and with Mandalay, we had it to the point where it looked like we were pretty close to, getting this movie financed and set up, and we were ready to go out to some huge actors. And unfortunately, one of the producers on that project ended up just getting a real bee in his bonnet about wanting more money. And it was a really unfortunate situation, but he was the only person out of the whole group who refused to agree to a number and was offered a lot of money, but still did not want to sign off on it. And because this producer was sort of the reason that we had gotten certain people involved with the project, it was a long story, but we needed him to agree to a deal. He wouldn't agree to the deal. And so the whole project kind of, at that moment, at that company, went down in flames. Really heartbreaking, but this is the sort of thing that happens a lot in this business. So the bright side, the silver lining of that, was that I got to be really good friends with Charles and with Bill and with some of the executives at Mandalay, one of whom would end up, becoming a particularly good friend of mine, this particular executive, whose name I don't know if I should mention or not. But anyways, but he's a great guy. We got to be good buddies. And so coming out of that experience, I now was trying to figure out what to do next. And I finished up my work on the Tupac film. Ultimately, at that moment, Antoine Fuqua decided to leave the project over creative differences. And after I turned in my 6th draft, the studio told me they wanted to go in another direction creatively. And so now they didn't want to develop it the way that Antoine and I had been developing it, or they didn't want to do that kind of movie anymore, which was, again, really heartbreaking. But, that's what happens on big movies. Writers come and go, and that's how it works. So coming off of that project, I was frustrated. And again, I was at a moment where I just kind of was questioning, like, what do I really want my career to be about? And right around that time, I got a phone call from Charles, the director who, was supposed to direct Hearts of Men, who had directed Drumline and all that. And Charles calls me up out of the blue, and he says, hey, I'm directing this movie that Denzel Washington was supposed to direct, and Denzel changed his mind, decided he wants to just produce it. But, Denzel and the company that he was doing it with, Alcon, they want to move forward, and they just hired me to be the director. And that's what Charles was telling me. And he said, but we're not happy with the script. And could you come in tomorrow and pitch to Denzel on this project? And again, it's like, often it will happen like that, where you don't get a lot of time to prepare. So Charles sent me the script. I read it that night, didn't sleep a lot, went in the next day and kind of gave my pitch to Denzel Washington and a room full of executives on how I would approach this film that they were doing. And unbeknownst to me, the executives at Alcon had been given Hearts of Men as my sample script, because this project that Denzel was supposed to direct for them had to do with high school kids. And so Charles and Alcon thought that Hearts of Men was a perfect sample script, because regardless of how dark or violent or whatever it was, it showed that I could write authentically in the voices of, 16, 17-year-old kids. So once again, this very non-commercial script that I wrote that people had told me not to write had now led me to a point where I'm sitting in a meeting with Denzel Washington pitching my take on another big studio film. So I ultimately was hired. Thank goodness. Denzel really liked my take, and Alcon hired me immediately, at which point I was told that I had 2 weeks to turn around a new draft. And it was a very accelerated timeline because they needed Denzel to be able to read the script before he started shooting another movie and blah, blah, blah. And so it was a crazy 2 weeks, but I managed to deliver a draft that Alcon and Denzel felt very good about. And so ultimately, that was a huge experience, and it got me into the position where I was now a writer that Alcon Entertainment felt good about. So while they were trying to put that project together and get that thing up and going, they asked me if I wanted to write another movie for them. and they told me they had this gangster film that they wanted me to write about the legendary Harlem icon Pee Wee Kirkland, who is a gangster and a street basketball legend in the 60s in New York, and has a very fascinating life story. And so Alcon asks me to write that for them. And it turns into an amazing working experience where I love the execs at Alcon. I love Pee Wee, who's still alive, and he ends up becoming a good friend of mine who's very involved with the development of his story. And again, I am in this position now where I'm writing, what is my third major studio assignment. And all of it has happened because I've written, just a couple of scripts that really no one in their right mind ever would have advised me to write. And in fact, people said the exact opposite as I was writing them, because these were not the scripts that, were quote unquote commercial. But yet, I'm now writing these big studio movies and working with these types of people. And so it kept occurring to me that like I had wasted so much time, and I had wasted so much time trying to write these other more commercial stories that I just didn't care about. And ultimately that's what people respond to in writing, I think, is they respond to you really deeply caring about stuff. And if you don't really deeply care about stuff, it's obvious on the page, and that's the easiest, quickest pass that an executive can ever make. I mean, the passion and how you feel is one element. And yes, there's a million other elements that'll determine whether or not something you write moves forward as a picture. But something that you can control is at least writing something you care about. So now, around the same time that that I've been developing this project, the Pee Wee Kirkland film for Alcon, I've been kind of noodling on my own personal script that's a really big, crazy science fiction story. And it's a science fiction story kind of in the vein of the Terry Gilliam movies that I loved as a kid. And this story is actually a TV show that I'm developing. It's a big, crazy science fiction TV show that's set 1,000 years in the future, and it's a really wild, wacky story. And at one point while I'm developing this story, I take a meeting with DreamWorks, and DreamWorks asks me what I'm working on, and I pitch this crazy sci-fi story to them, and they love it. And DreamWorks calls me back for a second meeting and tells me they want to buy the project, except they don't want to do it as a TV show, they want to do it as a movie. And so they make me an offer to buy this idea of mine and to develop it as a movie with me. But frustratingly to me at that moment, the deal that DreamWorks offered was just not, it was not a deal that I felt like was a good deal. It was essentially a deal where I was only going to get guaranteed one draft of this script that I was really passionate about, this story, and they would have the option to fire me after one draft. And as somebody who realized how quickly and easily Hollywood companies will fire a writer at that point, I didn't feel good about it. And so, my agents and my managers told me it was my decision, but to think carefully about this because they were offering a good chunk of money, which would have been a lot of money to me. But I decided not to sell that story to DreamWorks because it didn't feel like the right fit. I didn't feel good about it. So I ended up writing that script and writing a pilot script for it. And ultimately, to kind of bring things full circle, I recently showed that script to one of the executives who I'd worked with on Hearts of Men at Mandalay. And this executive has since gone on to now be the president of several other companies, and he's the president of a very cool big company now. And I sent him the script for it, and he flipped over it, and he loved it. And he immediately said he wanted to produce it, he wanted his company on board, and he wanted to immediately get it out to directors. And so he sent me the list of directors just a couple weeks ago for who he wants to approach to direct the pilot episode of this TV show. And the first name on his list was Terry Gilliam. And that just made me unbelievably happy because it really made me feel like I'm finally telling the kind of stories that I always wanted to tell. And I'm in a position now where those type of stories are basically my bread and butter, and my life is hopefully going to be structured around writing stories that I love for the foreseeable future. And that never would have happened if I tried to keep writing things that were commercial. And it all sort of brings me back to a moment that I had early in my career where I got some very good advice along these lines, which I managed to promptly ignore. But I happened to be in a screenwriting class maybe 20 years ago where Andrew Kevin Walker, who was the screenwriter of Seven, had come in as a guest speaker. And Andrew was talking about his experience and how he had worked as a Tower Records clerk making minimum wage in New York while he was writing Seven. And everyone told him while he was writing Seven, like his friends who were into film and stuff, that it was a really stupid idea for a movie and a total waste of time because Jesus Christ, like for those of you who've seen Seven, the ending is unbelievably depressing and sad and dark and awful. And who in Hollywood, who in their right mind would make such an awful movie, such a depressing, sad, horrible film? And ultimately, as it turned out, Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman and David Fincher would want to make that movie. And Andrew Kevin Walker's point when he was talking to this classroom I was in all those years ago is he essentially was saying very much what I'm saying today. He said, look, you need to write the stories that you care about and that you love the most. Because if you do that, when you finally get a break and when you break into the business, people are going to want to hire you to write the kind of shit that you love. And while he was quick to say, look, it's not the only way to become successful in Hollywood, of course, people have ideas that are commercial that sometimes sell, and that happens. But his point to the class I was in all those years ago, and I guess my point, to wrap this up today to you guys, is that if you do write something strictly from a place where you're trying to just come up with a commercial idea and it does sell, well, that's kind of a blessing and a curse in a way. Because Hollywood is very, very quick to pigeonhole people into what sort of thing they do. And so if you don't like heist movies, but yet you break into Hollywood by writing a heist movie, well, then that's what everyone's going to want to hire you to write, is like a heist movie or a thriller or a crime movie or something with similar elements to it. And if that's not your jam, and yet that's how you've broken in, that is ultimately, what you're going to be seen as a heist movie writer, or, a crime thriller writer, or what have you. And so Andrew Kevin Walker's point was just, look, you'll be in a golden cage, a gilded cage at that point. And that's not the kind of career that you want to have. And as he was pointing out, he wrote this really weird, dark, fucked up story because he was like a weird, dark, fucked up guy. And so because of that, people like Tim Burton came to him to write Sleepy Hollow, and filmmakers like David Fincher and people who were on his wavelength were the people who wanted to work with him. And so ultimately, that's what you should want to find, I think, as a creative person in Hollywood or anywhere else. You should want to find people who are on your wavelength, people who are part of your quote unquote sort of tribe, people who have similar artistic ideas or ambitions, and people that you can really vibe with and work with, because collaboration is always going to be kind of a bitch and a lot of work. And this is a very collaborative business. But at the very least, if you make your career be all about writing things that you're passionate about, then ultimately you're going to have the kind of career that you can feel really, really good about in the long term. And so at this moment, I'm at a point with this sci-fi TV show where in the coming weeks we're going to be approaching Terry Gilliam and some other super talented directors who I love, and I could not be more hyped about that. And I think what I would say is that everyone should want their career to be in service of the type of stories that you are most passionate about, instead of the inverse. So that's why, in my experience, writing your passion project, ultimately, at the end of the day, is the most commercial thing that anyone could do. And I would not listen to the naysayers and to the people who tell you that your idea could not possibly be a movie, because there's just endless examples of things like Being John Malkovich, or, there's a million other movies you could point to that are really weird, strange ideas that no one ever would have thought would catch on, but they did. And it was all because of the execution and because of the passion. And, this business is a really unique and weird business, but in my experience, people are going to respond to stuff that you really believe in. And whether you know it or not, it's transparent when you're writing something with any kind of other motive. And if you're writing something with a profit motive, I think that energy comes across in the script and people just sort of check out. And like I said, even if you happen to sell one of those scripts, that's not the kind of career that you want to have, just being a hired gun to write stuff you don't care about. So it's a weird business, and being a screenwriter is a peculiar and oftentimes bittersweet and frustrating occupation, but it's still the best job that I've ever had. And I hope there was something in the last 49 minutes that was useful or helpful for anybody, listening. And I would love to open it up for questions and any thoughts that you guys want to discuss.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephen. I loved it. That was great.
Thank you, Brianna.
There's a lot there, and it's a helpful reminder of how crazy this world can be, and that this leads to that, and something you never expected can lead to something you always wanted. So
totally.
Very cool. So the Q&A box down here, it looks like there's a couple people. Christopher's already asked questions, but for everyone else attending, pop your questions into that Q&A box right there.
Mm-hmm.
And well, it's a funny first question Chris has for you there. So do you see them? Do you see the question?
Yeah, I can see them right now. I see.
Cool.
The first question, just the one that says Terry Gilliam Brazil, Terry Gilliam, or Terry Gilliam 12 Monkeys, Terry Gilliam.
Right.
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, Christopher, but I will say that I love both those movies. And if you're asking whether it's Terry Gilliam in his more commercial 12 Monkeys mode, maybe, is that the question? Brianna, I don't know. Can you understand that question?
I'm not sure either. I'm sure he'll clarify it.
So Christopher, maybe clarify, if you don't mind, exactly what you mean. I love both those pictures, but I would say that probably the type of thing that I'm hoping to develop is probably more in the vein of 12 Monkeys. It's a little bit more accessible, kind of like 12 Monkeys, I would say it was.
Okay, cool. So that's what I'm gonna. And then he's got one more here. And guys, feel free to throw in some more questions if you have them.
Okay, so Christopher's next question is, in situations such as the one you discussed regarding DreamWorks, do you counter-offer with a different script in the same vein or just decline the offer? Thanks. Okay, no, in that situation, really, what I was most frustrated about was that they wanted the option to just to fire me so quickly in the process. And so what I counter-offered with, or what my team counter-offered with, was that we wanted a guaranteed, 3 drafts or something, so that I could have a legitimate chance to develop the material with DreamWorks. And so it wouldn't be a situation where like I sell them my baby and then I turn in my first draft and they fire me in 6 weeks before we've really had a chance to go back and forth and try and, build something. So really we just counter-offered with a request that they guarantee several more steps in my contract. And they said, at least that division of DreamWorks that I was dealing with, they said, that's not how we do things. And what they said was, we probably won't fire you after the first draft. So just essentially they said, trust us. And, that's something you should never do with a Hollywood company. So we could not reach an accord. And so it was not a situation where I could just present them with something in a similar vein, because it was a very unique story and they were responding specifically to that unique idea. So it wasn't like I could just be like, I got this other sci-fi script here. It was either this project or nothing. And they were not willing to bend. And so I walked away. And that's one of the things you have to do in your career sometimes. And I've had to do that like on a handful of occasions with jobs. And it's very scary. And sometimes a company will come back to you and they will give you a better offer. And sometimes they'll just walk away. And in that case, they walked away.
Cool. So he was clarifying his earlier career movies seemed more esoteric, so commercial.
Yeah, I would agree. I think for sure his earlier movies like the Monty Python films and just the early Gilliam stuff, for sure was more esoteric. I think the 12 Monkeys was kind of like a sweet spot where sort of like Hollywood met Terry Gilliam in a place where he could have big actors like Bruce Willis and Brad Pitt, yet still do a really fucking weird story and somehow get nominated for Oscars and actually make a decent amount of money. So the project that I'm hoping to work on with him, I would say is probably more in that vein, because I don't think it's that esoteric, but it's pretty fucking weird, but I don't think it's weird in a way that an audience will find boring or slow. I think it's just, so it is more 12 Monkeys in that, if we're comparing those films. The next question I see is from David, David Levy. And David asks, if the genre of a passion project is niche or segmented, does it matter as long as the script content is solid? Okay, that's a great question. And I would say, David, that it does not matter whatsoever. And that's like really the point of my talk here today is it does not matter if your project is super niche and super segmented. Really what matters is just how original your writing is. Because ultimately, very, 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 very few spec scripts get made into movies. So that's something to keep in mind, and it's not that romantic for screenwriters, and it didn't used to be that way to the extreme degree that it is now, but almost zero spec scripts get made into films. Like there's very few. So it's like 99% of the time, whatever original script you're writing is gonna end up being your audition and your showpiece to get hired to write something else. And so that's why it really doesn't make sense to try to engineer this perfect commercial construct, because they're not going to make the movie 99% of the time. They're looking at that as a writing sample for you. What they want to find more than anything is, do you have a voice? Do you have a voice that they can then plug into whatever projects they already know they want to make? And so the greatest compliment you can ever get as a screenwriter is when you meet someone and they say, wow, man, I read your script. It's got a really strong voice. And that's something that always makes me super happy whenever someone says that. And it's not about the content. It's not about how niche it is or how segmented or weird. The idea is you could literally write an amazing spec script about almost anything. You could write a spec script about, about a nurse who's dying of cancer and decides to go like on a trip to Hawaii in her final days. Like that sounds like a really sad, depressing story. But if you make that character of the nurse the most like quirky, unbelievably strange and interesting person, that's suddenly a hell of a showpiece for you as a writer. So I would say don't worry about content. Like content, I think, is really vastly overrated. And ultimately what you should be worried about is, what's my voice as a writer? How is my writing unique and different? And how does my writing not sound like everyone else? Okay. I see Christopher's next question here. Hey, Brianna, you still there?
I am.
Oh, okay, cool. All right.
Hey, I'm here. Sorry.
No worries. I just want to make sure the connection was still good.
Yeah.
So question from Christopher. Has it been your experience that when you turn down a company or people in general, that they hold it against you later? What's a good way to handle those situations? Thanks. Okay. I would say in my experience, no one holds it against you. Everyone understands it's a business, and it's as simple as that. Just like you can't hold it against a company if they make you a crappy offer on something. If, a year later they make you a good offer on something, you can't get caught up. It's hard sometimes because, these are stories you care about your career, but you can't get caught up with like worrying what people are going to think about you or your own emotions. Ultimately, the companies don't care. They don't give a shit. And as proof of that, after I passed on the offer from DreamWorks, they've since contacted me twice. And it's the exact same executives who I passed on, the offer from. And the same executives have contacted me twice about writing new films for them. And so that's a discussion that's ongoing. And if anything, I would say that when you pass on an offer, you actually gain a lot of respect from those executives, because whether they say it or not, it makes them look at you as more of a creative person and more of an artist. And it makes them respect you that much more and honestly want to work with you that much more, because it shows you've got some integrity. And although, a lot of people in Hollywood, would not say that it's a town full of integrity, I think executives love the idea of someone having integrity because it makes them feel like they're doing something more meaningful and working with someone who actually gives a shit. So I would say never worry about saying no to an offer, as long as you're respectful and you're not rude to anyone. It's a business, and the town is far too big to hold things against people and hold grudges. And really, all they care about at DreamWorks or at any other company is, what's your next script? Is it something we could make money off of? Is it an original idea? Do we like it? That's really all that matters. Next question from Christopher is, has it been your experience that when you turn down a company, or no, I'm sorry, that's the same one I just answered. Okay, should we shop passion projects as spec scripts, knowing the likelihood of it being made is low? Or
sorry, I think we lost you there for a second. So
oh yeah, sure.
We just reread the question. Sorry, it went like muted
yeah.
and then back. Okay, cool.
Yeah, no problem. So the next question is, should we shop passion projects as spec scripts, knowing the likelihood of it being made is low, or hold on to them until we hopefully have more pull? Thanks. Okay, I would say hold on to nothing. Ultimately, if you have a great script and you think it's a great script, I would do whatever you can to get it out there. And that script, the only way you're going to get more pull, as you say, is by getting people excited about you as a writer. So I would say, don't be too precious with holding on to anything, and just look at yourself as a creative person as someone who's going to have an endless amount of great ideas in the future. And so you don't need to hold on to anything. If you've written something and you think it's a great script and it's a passion project that's super not commercial, I would still try to get it out there as much as possible, because that's what's going to get you hired to write things and build your career. So yeah, don't hold on to anything. Next question from Christopher. Oh yeah, you're saying you wouldn't want to be considered a prima donna or arrogant and difficult, etc. One of my ex-girlfriends said something to me once when I was concerned about a similar thing. And it was sometime when I was worried that I was being difficult, quote unquote, with some company. And she just said to me, look, you're in a business that's full of crazy people, which is true. And there are people who are truly deeply maladjusted and dysfunctional and extremely difficult in this business. And you will encounter them on occasion. As long as you're not one of those people, as long as you're not treating people with cruelty, or as long as you're not just being a horrible, awful presence, no one's going to think of you as a prima donna. No one's going to think of you as difficult. As long as you're somewhere on the spectrum of normal and polite, you're not a prima donna for thinking, that a deal is not good. You're not a prima donna for wanting a particular script to be sent out to people. Writers just have to find the right balance, and it's really hard. It's taken me a very long time, between being assertive and wanting to have your career look a certain way, but then also listening to the people around you and taking their advice sometimes. And it's a very hard balance, but I would not worry about being called a prima donna, because really writers are the last people in this town who are prima donnas most of the time. Okay, the next question I see is, let's see, from Arthi, and I don't know, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Arthi. Absolutely amazing story, loved it, Stephen. Thank you very much, I appreciate that. Thanks for sharing. Was wondering if you had any advice on working with reps. Oh, good, I pronounced it right, excellent. And what a writer's expectation should be when we're working with reps. In your opinion / experience, what qualities make a good manager / agent? Okay, excellent question, Arthi. That's a fantastic question, and it's one of the most difficult things that any screenwriter has to deal with, and it's something that myself and my screenwriter friends are constantly bitching and complaining about, and over the years, it's taken me a very long time to feel really good about my reps. And even still, there's always going to be hiccups, because people are busy, and no matter what rep you're with, they're going to have 20 or 30 or 50 clients, and they're not always going to be able to give you the kind of attention that you feel like you deserve. So that's difficult. What I would say is, it took me a long time to learn that you should not be with a rep who's going to try to convince you to write stuff you don't want to write. And so early on in my career, especially because I broke into the business so young, I was 21. And so when a huge agent says to me, okay, this weird thing you wrote is great, but you have to write more commercial stuff, I believed him. And then I feel like I sort of chased my tail for a number of years doing that. So the best advice I would give you is try to find someone you think you're creatively simpatico with and creatively compatible with, because there are agents and managers out there who represent people who do very idiosyncratic work, or things that are, just a little bit off the beaten path. And so you should know what kind of stuff you want to write, and make sure that you sign with a management company or an agency, and specifically a manager or an agent that really believes in you doing what you want to do. And right now I'm repped by a management company called Circle of Confusion. And part of the reason that I signed with Circle specifically was because they represent half of my favorite comic book creators and their projects in the world of feature films and TV. And being such a huge comic book geek and somebody who knows that I want my career in the future to deal with stories that are sci-fi, fantasy, comic booky, etc., I felt like Circle was the perfect fit for me, because I knew that's where I wanted my career to go. So I would say look at the roster and sort of the reputation of the company you're signing with, and even more so the actual rep, and just make sure that you guys are on the same page. Because if you're not, you're just going to end up fighting each other. Even if it's passive aggressive, you'll end up fighting each other and you waste a lot of time. So just find someone that supports you being who you want to be as an artist. And that sounds simple, but it's very hard to find because, just like anything else, like it's like dating. It's like having a relationship, and your representative in this town is a really important thing, your manager, your agent. And if you make the wrong choice with that, it's just it's very difficult to get your career on track if you're constantly fighting with your own team. So I hope that makes sense.
There was a question in the chat box that I'm gonna get before we go back to these other two.
Sure.
The question is, do you find pitching the TV project you've written different than pitching the film projects?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, I do. It's very different, especially because people will ask you questions that are much more far-reaching in scope. And so when I'm pitching the TV show, a producer or an executive might say to me, "Oh, that's great for the pilot script, et cetera. What happens at the end of season 1? What's the arc for the whole season? And by the way, where's the story going in season 2 or season 3?" And so those are the kind of questions as a screenwriter on films that you don't really have to deal with because there's just the script you wrote and that is what it is. Where with TV, you've got to really be thinking many, many steps ahead and ideally have some good answers when people say, "Hey, what's the big cliffhanger at the end of season 1? What are the shocking twists or reveals?" You have to have some real answers so people don't think you're just going to be spinning your wheels for all these seasons. So I would say that's a difference. And I think the other difference is they're more open to weird and original ideas right now in TV than they are in films. And, like everyone who's following the business at all knows, they're making a lot less films. And most of the films that are being made are based on pre-established IP. And it's very difficult to make a movie that's kind of a weird original thing. Whereas in TV, people are a lot more adventurous on the TV side. And if you look at like the great TV shows over the last however many years, a lot of them, like Breaking Bad or Lost, are not even based on any previously established IP. They're just incredible, cool ideas and worlds that have sprung from these writers. And so I think TV is a lot more open to a writer just going to new and unique and original places. So that's something I appreciate when I'm talking about a TV show or I'm pitching a TV show. I feel like people are a lot more open, and I can pitch crazy stuff a lot more so than I can on the film side these days. So I think that's probably the biggest differences. Let me see. I think Christopher's next question is kind of also along these lines. You mentioned being asked to reconstruct your script in a different format, such as a movie to a TV show. I've encountered this as well. What's the appropriate way to handle this? Should you ask for money or a deal, et cetera, before doing that? Is that a stalling technique? I can elaborate if I'm not being clear enough. Thanks. It's a hard thing to say. If someone reads your movie script and they say, "Hey, we think it'd be a better TV show," unless you're already a name writer, very few people are going to actually pay you. Very few producers are going to pay you out of their own pocket to rewrite something. What they're more than likely going to want to do is have you write it for free, and then they're going to take it around to some networks and try to get the networks to write you a check. It's very rare that most producers will especially write a check to an unknown or up and coming writer. I would say like most people would say never do free work in Hollywood, or a lot of people would say that. I think that's not necessarily true, but I would be very cautious about doing free work. For example, if you've decided you want to turn your movie script into a TV show regardless, and it's something you want to do, and you happen to have a producer who agrees with you and they've got connections or they're excited about you doing this, well, sure, go ahead and do it. And then if they don't pay you, fine, no harm, no foul, you want to do it anyways. But in general, I would just make sure you weigh your options carefully and just think about, okay, if I'm going to do X amount of free work for anyone, what do they bring to the table that makes this, a worthy gamble for me? Okay, like for example, I had a Broadway musical that I was developing for Dr. Dre a few years ago, and that was a very bizarre project that fell into my lap. And I ended up going to Dr. Dre's house, having a meeting with him there, and he had this original idea for a Broadway show. And my agents had said to me, "Look, they want to meet with you and talk to you, and they want you to write an outline, but we're pretty sure, they're going to do this deal, but he wants to meet with you now. So just go talk to him and then write an outline, blah, blah, blah." And I knew it was a little bit of a risk, but I also knew that the payoff, if the Broadway musical went forward, would be significant for me. And that it was, a Dr. Dre project that would have a lot of visibility. So in that case, I wrote an outline for free. And then I went and I did the meeting and blah, blah, blah. And then for a variety of reasons, Dr. Dre ended up changing his mind 3 months later. And even though they'd been negotiating a contract to pay me, once he changed his mind, they just changed. That was it. The contract was off the table and the whole thing went by. So that was frustrating. But at the same time, I don't think I would have done it any differently, because at that moment, it seemed like a huge opportunity. I knew it was a gamble. But that's the kind of thing you have to ask yourself. Is the person who's asking for free work, worth me potentially wasting some time? And you never know. And it's different from in case to case. But in general, if you ask someone to give you money to restructure whatever, it's pretty rare that a producer will just write you a check. Next question from Larry Woldenberg. Larry says, what if you get optioned, but the notes that you get seem out to lunch? Is there a way around this? Okay, well, that's a very good question, Larry. That happens. That definitely happens. And that ultimately was the reason that I ended up not moving forward with John Cusack's company, with Weasel. It was, although they had optioned a script that was a very dark, violent script about a 12-year-old killer, one of the producers at the company was kind of constantly pushing me toward softening up the script and making it less violent, et cetera, et cetera. And at a certain point, you kind of have to decide what your own line is. And especially with an option, I mean, there's not much they can do if you say, I don't want to go there with the script, because especially if it's an option, you're going to get the rights back in 6 months or whatever. So you've got a little bit more leverage with an option where you can say, hey, let's find something we both feel good about. That's not this story. Otherwise, I would say, you have to know, what you're willing to walk away from. And I had a subsequent company rather, who optioned Weasel for me after John Cusack's company. And this company, again, optioned this very dark, violent script about a 12-year-old killer. But over the process of various notes and years, they ultimately arrived at the idea that they wanted me to age the main character up from 12 years old to 18, which made it a completely different story. And so at that point, I was just kind of like, all right, check, please. This isn't going to work. That's a different movie. And as long as it's an option deal, you have the latitude to say that. If someone's actually purchased your script, though, then it's a different situation. Then you have now forfeited all rights, you forfeited all control, and you've gotten a much larger check. And so that's kind of the difference between optioning and selling something. And so I would say if the notes are out to lunch from a producer on someone who's optioned some material, I would have a very polite discussion with them where you say, look, I'm really not feeling these notes. Why don't we have a talk and just see if we can find some common ground here? Because you have the power to do that in the case of an option, not so much if you've sold your script. The next question I see from David is, did you write a series Bible after writing the TV pilot, or did you wait until it was requested? Great question. I actually wrote a series Bible before I wrote the pilot, and that might have been unusual. I don't know, but for me, I just kind of needed to get clear on some of the big sort of major elements in the story, especially because it's a science fiction story and there's a lot of world building involved. And I wanted to have a Bible for myself to kind of look at, and when we say Bible, it's really just a fancy way of saying it's just a general overall prospectus for the world of the TV series and what kind of a show it's going to be. But it gives you some kind of broad guidelines to follow. I think it's a good idea to write a Bible, early in the process. And right now, as we're going out and pitching this TV show to directors, I have a script and I also have a Bible. And my producers told me that the very next step, if we get a director to respond to the script, they're going to want to see the Bible. They're going to want to see the Bible, and they're going to want to have a very detailed conversation about the world, et cetera. So I think it's a great idea to have a Bible done. It's not essential. I mean, it's less necessary with certain types of stories. If you're writing a science fiction story, then yeah, you definitely need a fucking Bible. If you're writing a fantasy story, definitely need a fucking Bible. If you're writing a story that's set in modern day LA, and it's just a story about, a bunch of waiters working at a restaurant in LA, I mean, you don't need a Bible probably as much, because it's not this whole kind of epic world or this weird thing you have to sort of acclimate people to. So I think it depends a little bit on the story, exactly how necessary it is. But I think by and large, it's a great idea to have a Bible, just because it's a great exercise for you as a writer. And it does make you seem much more like you're the adult in the room and you have a vision. And ultimately, that's all that executives want, is they want somebody who comes across as having a vision and who has given something a lot of careful thought, so that when they ask you questions, you have well thought out, carefully considered answers, and you're not stuck with nothing to say. Worst thing you can ever do in a pitch meeting is have someone ask you a question and you've got just a ridiculous answer for it. So a Bible can really help sort of safeguard you, and you'll be more prepared. So I think it's a good idea. Not always essential, but a great idea. Christopher, thank you so much. Now let's say you have two formats of the same project. A movie you reformatted into a series. How should you pitch it, given that you don't want people to think you aren't certain of your own project? Okay, so you have two formats, same project. You've reformatted into a series. I would pitch it in whatever way you think is most appropriate. I mean, if you think it's better as a TV show, I would pitch it as a TV show. If you're stuck 50-50 and you feel like it could literally work either way, then I would probably pitch it in whatever way is appropriate based on the people you're talking to. The industry is fairly stratified. So meaning between film and like, theatrical releases and television. So those executives, generally, they don't really commingle too much. Meaning, if you're going into a meeting with a feature film executive, they don't want to hear about a TV show. And, by the same token, if you're meeting with a TV exec, they don't care about a movie. So I would just pitch it however is appropriate based on the context of the room you're in or based on the person you're talking to. And if you literally think it could work either way, then that's fine. You could say it's an idea and a story I've been developing, as X, but I think it could also really work as Y. That's okay. But I would urge you to really think carefully about if there's a stronger format for the idea. Because in my case, I did try writing this sci-fi story as a feature film several times, and it was just too much. It just felt like it was too much to fit in a movie. And when I kind of reconceptualized it as a TV show, it felt like things fell into place much more naturally and I wasn't having to fight so much. So I would just give it careful thought. Wendy Pierce, do you find that executive notes generally soften a project? That's a great question, Wendy. I think that the general thought, like the sort of the cliche idea, is that executives will always soften your project and executives will always make things worse. In my experience, that is the case sometimes, but not all the time, and not even necessarily the majority of the time. It really depends on the company you're dealing with, the executives you're dealing with. And I have honestly found, like particularly dealing with Alcon the last few years, I have fantastic executives at Alcon. They're super smart. And frequently, their notes to me on the two films I've written to them have actually wanted to make things harder or edgier or, weirder. And they're, we're constantly in like a push-pull where we're trying to like find the line in terms of what story we're telling. But I would say that I've been really heartened and gratified where, I'll get notes sometimes where executives will say to me, does the ending have to be so happy? Can it be a little bit more sad? And I think that is a thing that happens these days. And I've heard similar stories from friends of mine who are writers. And the thing you'll find in Hollywood, at least what I was surprised by, is that a lot of executives are very smart. Like a lot of the executives at these companies are very smart, passionate, well-informed, film lovers or TV lovers. And they really genuinely are trying to make incredible work and help find a way to make something great. The problem is that the people who run the companies are not necessarily always on that page. And so as much as an executive is awesome and gives you great notes, they might be fired 3 months after they hire you, or they might be leaving the company most likely within a year. So there are various levels where you've got to kind of like, you've got to battle different fights at different levels. But overall, I'd say executives in my experience have frequently been very smart and frequently have pushed me to make stories better, not worse. Christopher Lynn, what are your thoughts as to the line between protecting your passion project and being too precious with it? Aside from attitude, what would get you a bad rep insofar as being difficult to work with because you're too precious or demanding/controlling? I have a couple passion projects I care about deeply, but several I love, but am not so invested. Okay, I think the line between protecting your passion project and being too precious with it, I mean, that's a hard question because I think it's going to be different for everyone. If you've got a passion project that's a story about a little girl, growing up and going to summer camp in Connecticut, and it's about what happens to her in summer camp and blah, 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 like that's a very specific story. You might have a company come to you and say, hey, we want to make this movie, but we want it to be about a little boy. And for you, that might be a deal breaker. You might say no, like the whole point of the story is it's about a little girl's experience growing up. It's not about, it's completely different if you switch it out like this. And so in that case, I think it's really important to listen to your instincts, because like I knew with my script Weasel, when the executives were telling me at one company that we really needed to age that character from 12 to 18, I knew that was a totally moronic idea because the whole story would not work. It would just be ridiculous. And so you have to know where that line is. But at the same time, you also want to be open, and you want to be open because sometimes people will have really good ideas and those ideas will not come from you, but sometimes they will have great ideas. And, I've been in a lot of writing classes, and, more recently I'm in a writer's group that meets every 2 weeks, me and a bunch of other professional screenwriters. There's like 9 or 10 of us, and we develop ideas and workshop scripts together every 2 weeks. And frequently, some of the best ideas in my scripts are not things that I think of, but they're things that are suggested to me by like my friends and, colleagues and people who've read my script. So I think it's important to be open that even if it's your passion project, someone else might have an idea that actually makes it better, and that you should consider that and really, carefully think about stuff. So you're not just responding totally from a place of ego. But at the same time, there is a line where what your story is supposed to be. And I think there was a great quote that kind of speaks to this from the big time screenwriters, Terry Elliott and Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio, the guys who wrote Pirates of the Caribbean and a million other movies. And they talked about how anytime they're working on a studio project, there's usually about a half a dozen things that they know they have to pretend or protect. Half a dozen things that they have to protect rather, to the death of themselves, because if any of these half a dozen things are changed, it's going to fundamentally just destroy the movie or ruin the story. And that those are the 6 things they will fight tooth and nail to keep the way they are. But that in any given movie, there's hundreds of elements you could change, and you could still hold on to the spirit of the movie. Same with a TV show. There's hundreds of elements you could change and still hold on to the spirit of what your story is. And so anytime you're asking someone to give you millions and millions of dollars of their money to make your idea, there's going to be some compromise. There's going to be some concession, and that's just the nature of the business. So your job, I think, as a screenwriter and as someone who does not want to be labeled as a prima donna, is to think really carefully and do your own personal inventory, and to find out what are the ideas that I absolutely know this story has to protect, and then what are the things that are more malleable, And I think you'll find that if you compromise a little bit with executives and you let them sort of, be involved in developing things, that they will back off a lot, and they will frequently even say, oh, you know what, let's go back to the way you had it originally. That was better. That happens. But if you put up a wall and you just say, no, we can't change this, or this, and you basically come across as someone who's non-collaborative, then they're going to want to change everything. So I would just find your own line and know what you feel like your story needs, and then realize you're in a collaborative business and that it's not going to be exactly what you thought it was going to be, but that doesn't mean it's going to be worse. Larry asks, if you get a TV show accepted, would that tie you up creatively for the next 2 to 3 years? Would the workload be simply too great to think about feature writing in the meantime? Well, Larry, I would say my answer is I would hope that it ties me up for at least the next 2 to 3 years, because that would be wonderful, because that would mean I had a TV show on the air and that things were going well. That would be amazing. In terms of whether it would tie you up to the point where you could not write a feature film, very likely, yes. Very likely, particularly like in season 1, yes. As the show continues to be on the air, maybe you're able to delegate more and more responsibilities. Probably not so much in seasons 2, 3, 4, but I think especially for the first season, maybe the first couple seasons, that show is your baby. And if you're lucky enough to get your baby on the air and people are giving you tens of millions of dollars to write it, you probably should be pretty focused on it. And it is an overwhelming amount of work in terms of like what you're going to suddenly have to be responsible for. So it's not impossible. I mean, I know friends of mine who work on TV shows or have their own TV shows and still do write features. But I think it's like anything. Some people can handle much greater workloads than others. I've got a friend of mine who only has to sleep 4 hours a night. And so even though he's got 2 kids, he sleeps 4 hours a night, wakes up, and he's got 2 or 3 hours to write before he goes to work on his TV show. And I don't know how he does it, because if I get less than 6 hours of sleep, I'm a zombie, and I prefer 6 or 7, so it just depends, just like with anything else. Different people have different bandwidths, and you might be someone who has a bandwidth where you can handle a lot, but I would say most people could not really handle doing a TV show and a whole lot of other stuff simultaneously. I think it is too much work in general.
I think those are the questions, and we're right at time. So.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's awesome. Great questions, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. This was awesome. This was really, really helpful. Any parting words? We have a few minutes if you have. You've already given like a lot of encouraging parting words, but if you've got anything else while you're thinking about it.
Let me see. Parting words. I guess I would just say, I would encourage everybody who's serious about being a screenwriter to, if you can, take classes and find someone who can be a mentor. And finding a mentor is a really important thing. And it was like a critical part of my development. And I feel like I developed a lot more quickly as a screenwriter because I was working with a professional screenwriter who was at times super encouraging, but at times also super critical and pushed me to become like the best version of myself. And, having that mentor is invaluable. So I would really encourage everyone, and I'm not saying the mentor has to be any specific person, just someone who works for you, someone who you feel like you vibe with, who has some experience and who can help you along. Because in my life, I feel like the people who I've seen progress really quickly as screenwriters have been the ones who have embraced mentorship and found other writers to help them. And the writers who I know whose careers haven't really panned out so well, who are more insular and protective of their work, are the people that don't really seek out criticism. And I think it's really critical, that you do that because this whole business is about being critiqued and evaluated. And so the sooner you get comfortable with that and the sooner you have a feedback loop with your writing and getting responses to it, then the faster you're going to progress. So I would say, I think it's great that people, come and listen to a webinar like this, and I hope everyone's gotten something that could be helpful out of this. But I would say a webinar, even a webinar every month is not going to be enough. And whether it's with me or with, someone else, I would just encourage everyone to find a regular feedback loop with a mentor, and then ideally other writers, varying levels that you can be working with and workshopping scripts with. And even if you can't afford a class, find a writer's group, create a writer's group. There's tons of people who want to be doing this. Wherever you live, there's probably a few people around you or a lot of people around you who want to be doing the same thing. Find those people, put together a writer's group and meet with them every week or two, and you guys will push each other. And those are the kind of people who I see kind of flourishing in this business. And the people who just kind of are working on their own epic personal script all by themselves for 3 years, in general, are writing something that no one's going to care about. And by the time they finally send it out into the world, no one's going to respond to it. So you're writing something for an audience. So the sooner you involve an audience with your process, the better. So I would just keep that in mind and, build your inner circle, build your community of people that you trust, because that'll make, in my experience, that'll make all the difference between how productive you are and how motivated you are. And it'll keep you accountable to someone else. Because if you're just writing on your own, no one really cares if you finish your draft or not. But if you're in a group full of people that are all working forward and making some kind of momentum, it's going to be embarrassing to show up at your writer's group with no pages week after week after week. So it'll force you to be productive. And I think that's a really good place to put yourself in as an aspiring writer.
That was awesome. I'm glad I asked, because that was great parting words.
Cool. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Brianna. And thank you, everyone who tuned in today, or, much appreciated. And I wish you all the best of luck with this very strange, unique business.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephen. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.